Okay, in this lecture we're going to continue on with a few more details about what's going on in the epidermis of the skin. So we talked about the stratum basale in a little bit more detail in the previous video lecture clip, and so now we're going to move up and talk a little bit more about what's happening in the stratum spinosum. So moving up to the next sublayer of the epidermis. So your main cell type in that area. Now, there's a difference between tissue names and cell types. So the tissue name for the epidermis is a type of stratified squamous epithelium. The cell name, most of the cells in the epidermis are keratinocytes, and the keratinocytes have a flat shape. They are squamous in shape and appearance, and yes, they are layered, they're multi-layered, they're stratified, but those most of the cells in that sublayer are called, if you're just thinking about, well, what's the name of those types of cells, they're called the keratinocytes. So you can have squamous epithelial cells throughout the body that are not identical to each other. They look like each other, they're playing a similar role perhaps as far as being a part of an epithelial tissue, but they'll have other specialized jobs depending on where they're located in the body. Okay, so keratinocytes are a particular type of cell that we have in the stratum spinosum, and their main job is they are in the process of making keratin. That's their big job, and they are filling up on the inside with what can be called pre-keratin filaments. So it's not completely mature keratin, it's in the process of being made. You also have a lot of melanin granules in this sublayer. Melanin, again, is a dark skin pigment. And its main function is protection or shielding from ultraviolet light. Okay, so ultraviolet light from the sun, that's something we cannot see. Our eyes don't detect ultraviolet light, but nevertheless it is part of the rays that come from the sun. And ultraviolet light, what it does is it causes DNA mutations. So what is a DNA mutation? So DNA molecules are strands of AGCT nucleotides that are linked together. Those are the building blocks of DNA, and you're supposed to have a certain sequence of those in your genetic recipes. And a DNA mutation simply means that, let's say in one location you're supposed to have a G as part of that genetic recipe, and it gets changed to an A. That is a DNA mutation. So ultraviolet light can trigger changes in the DNA. If you trigger changes in the DNA of your cells, if you have enough of them, the cell's going to die because all of its genetic recipes are now screwed up, and it no longer has the proper genetic recipes that it needs to function properly. In other cases, ultraviolet light can alter genetic recipes such that cells which are not supposed to divide do begin to divide. So the cell cycle gets screwed up. That cell cycle we were talking about at the end of the last video lecture. So ultraviolet light can cause severe damage to the skin if you get exposed to enough of it, and it can also trigger skin cancer down the road, which many of us have heard of before. Let me erase all that. Another type of cell you have in the stratum spinosum, dendritic cells. So they kind of look really spidery, like there would be the main body of the cell. They have lots of these little appendages that stick off of them like that. Those are dendritic cells, and they are really good at capturing, let's say you've got some little tiny bacteria, are much smaller than our cells. All those little spidery appendages they have extending throughout much of the stratum spinosum, they're really good at capturing bacteria and other viruses, other things you get exposed to. And then they do phagocytosis, if you remember that. They internalize and digest those poor little creatures that are trying to invade your body from the surface. Okay, I have flipped forward a few slides here because I just want to give you guys a better visual of these things that we're talking about. All right, so right in here, this is our stratum spinosum. The epidermis can be wavy, so we're all through there. There's your stratum spinosum. And so most of the cells in here are keratinocytes, the ones that look flat and kind of spiny. Spinosum refers to spine. Those are keratinocytes, so their main job is manufacturing lots and lots and lots of keratin. And then this purple guy over here that looks kind of spidery, that's a dendritic cell. Those are good at capturing any germs that might be trying to invade from the surface, or if you cut your skin open and bacteria up on the surface can now have access to deeper tissues. Hopefully those dendritic cells will capture them. Doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. And then the other thing you have here in the stratum spinosum are, alright, so this cell right here, highlight it, this one that's kind of in gray, that's called a melanocyte or a melanocyte. Those are the cells that actually make melanin. So they make melanin. Melanin gets packaged up into granules, and melanin is a dark pigment, and then those cells actually, they have little appendages that stick out everywhere up here into the stratum spinosum, and they send those melanin granules into the keratinocytes. So the melanocytes make the melanin, they transfer the melanin into the keratinocytes, and then once it's in there, the melanin protects the cells from UV damage. More specifically, it's protecting the cell's DNA. That's the big problem. Ultraviolet light damages the DNA that can cause those cells to die or become cancerous in some cases down the road. Okay, so that's where all those things are located. Let me back up over here. Go backwards. Alright, how about the stratum granulosum? We talked a little bit about this in the last video lecture. So there you just have a few layers of cells, and it's called the granulosum because they're filled with granules, and some of those granules contain lipids, or they're actually sugar lipid combinations called glycolipids. What those are going to do is, once you get to the stratum corneum, top part of the epidermis, you got all the dead cells in there. These glycolipids, so if you have these dead cells up at the surface of the skin, these glycolipids, I'll kind of do them in yellow. They fill in some spaces around those cells, and they help create a waterproof seal at the surface of the skin because they're lipids. Lipids repel water. Imagine if we didn't have a waterproof barrier with the skin, that you could actually soak moisture through your skin into the deeper tissues of your body, which would not be too good. And you would also lose a lot of water from the underlying tissues in your skin. It could evaporate more easily out of your body and to the atmosphere. So it's a good thing we have those things there. Other granules in the cells of the stratum granulosum contain these developing keratin protein fibers. Pretty much these cells just become big sacs full of keratin and these glycolipids, and at this point they're dying, in the process of dying. They're very weak because they're cut off from the blood supply that you have down in the dermis. Alright, in thick skin areas of the body you do have that stratum lucidum. We talked a little bit about that on the first lecture for the epidermis. If you looked at that under the microscope, it would look transparent, and the cells in there are dead. All right, and then finally, when you get up to the stratum corneum, or corneum, corneum, by the way, literally means horny layer. Horny in the sense that things look spiky in that area if you're looking at them under the microscope. So up in here, you have 20 to 30 rows of dead, keratinized. You can't even really call them cells that much anymore because they're dead and no longer functioning. And so you have these sacs that are full of keratin, and that's surrounded by those glycolipids like we were just talking about, and that helps create the barrier there at the surface. What this keratin does is it's a very tough type protein. Keratin is protecting you from abrasion, cuts, tears, blocks things from being able to invade into deeper tissues. You have the glycolipids there that are helping with waterproofing, and again, that's to keep water out, and it also prevents you from losing water from your body fluids quite as easily. And so this is the main goal of the epidermis, is to function as a barrier and to protect you from biological problems like bacteria and viruses. You're keeping those nasty things out. Chemicals that we get exposed to, many of those cannot get through that tight barrier that you have there in the stratum corneum. And then physical assaults, things like cuts and wounds, and it doesn't always work, but imagine if we didn't have a nice tough surface barrier there, we would get injured a lot more than we typically do. Stratum corneum is, the thickness of that will vary dramatically between thinner areas of the skin and thicker. So like if you get a callus on your hands, or index finger, or wherever, a lot of people have a callus on their index finger, what's happening there is when you use a portion of the skin extensively, there's more stimulation of mitosis down in here in the stratum basale, and you wind up retaining, so these cells get replaced more quickly, and you retain more of them, the dead leftover cells in your stratum corneum, and the stratum corneum thickens, and that's how you develop a callus. And that's a homeostasis type thing. Your body is trying to protect itself from overuse of the skin in certain areas by developing calluses. Also, you have thicker skin on the soles of your feet because you walk on the soles of your feet, so you need a thicker stratum corneum there to protect your feet from injury. They're going to be more prone to injury. So areas of the skin more likely to be injured are going to have a thicker stratum corneum. Okay, so that completes our overview of the epidermis. We're going to move on in lecture number 4 down into the dermis and see what's happening in that major layer of the skin.